one thing I found when I came to the Library of Congress were these reminiscence books. They were little like autograph books, basically. I had one when I was a kid. Whenever I go to Disneyland, I would take it with me. But in these books, William Olin Bourne, who was a volunteer in the hospital and an editor and a writer, he had the soldiers who were recuperating in Central Park Hospital in New York sign their names. Some of them left messages, some of them just signed their names in very, scrawl. They're clearly recovering from their wounds. Some of them had come to the hospital to get their artificial limbs because the federal government subsidized artificial limbs for Union veterans. Of course, not for Confederate veterans. They had to rely on their states for those. So when they're there, they're writing, they're saying thank you to Bourne. And so in 1864, one soldier named F.L. Mahan, he wrote his name, his regiment, and his hometown in very large and sloppy letters in one of these books. And beneath his entry, William Olin Bourne wrote in pencil, written with the left hand. Mr. Mahan lost his right arm in the Battle of Resaca, Georgia. I just realized I've never said Resaca out loud, so I don't know. Am I saying that right? Resaca? I think it's Resaca. People can correct me if I'm wrong. Sorry. 15th May 1864 under General Hooker. So obviously Bourne was recognizing in the veterans that he was encountering this phenomenon of men who had been right-handed but had lost either their complete arm, their hand, or the use of their right arm, and were now going to have to write with their left hands. So a year later, in 1865, Bourne held the first of two penmanship contests. He called on men who had lost their right arms, again, only Union soldiers, Union veterans, to submit specimens of their best left-handed business writing, so business penmanship. This was something you could be taught, you could learn at the time. Now all we do is type, and apparently kids don't even know how to read cursive anymore. But in the 19th century, obviously all writing was done by hand. And penmanship was extremely important, and legible penmanship was extremely important for jobs like being a stenographer or a secretary or a clerk or a bookkeeper. So that's what business writing, but you could go to school and learn how to write your best business penmanship. And you could also, after the Civil War, learn business schools started teaching left-handed penmanship to account for all the men who were returning from the battlefields minus their right arm or the ability to use their right hand. So some of the veterans who submitted, they just sent in very straightforward descriptions of their enlistment. There's a lot of talk about mustering, you enlist and then you muster early in the war, and then later on, you're just enlisting in already existing regiments. They talk about a lot of marching. They talk about their wounding and discharge, while others, go beyond just sort of that straightforward narration, and they reflect on the political and personal ramifications of their sacrifice. So what were they fighting for? What does it mean that they were wounded in this way? Others wrote poems, and those are the ones that I focused on primarily in my first book. And so I'm gonna talk to you about some of those veterans and what exactly they're doing with their poetry. Like I said, Bourne hoped to publish what he called the united production of several left-armed veterans of the battlefield. He said that it would be one of the best literary contributions to the history of the war, as well as the memorial of an entirely new feature in literature. One of the veterans writing to Bourne said, I think that this published book will be as important as the Bible, or, second only to the Bible. So there were not just Bourne was interested in seeing this manuscript come to fruition. The Civil War has been called the unwritten war. The scholar Daniel Aaron referred to it as such, and there has been sort of this conception. It's gone away now, luckily, as more scholarship has been written. But this idea that the Civil War didn't really produce any great literature or a lot of important writing. And so really this part of what this archive of writings does is disprove that. And they are very important in terms of helping us understand how Americans responded to and interpreted the Civil War and its significance. So the men were asked to submit specimens, like I said. And one thing that's interesting, if you think about like what specimens, it kind of sounds like a scientific, or, you know, I'm giving you this specimen of something, really focus, it's something to look at, to be examined. And Bourne was hoping that the specimens would be evidence of the ability of amputee veterans to make their bodies useful and to reintegrate into American society and into an increasingly industrial workforce. So if they couldn't push a plow, then they could become a stenographer or a bookkeeper or do something useful in that way. However, the contest did provide an opportunity for amputees to kind of construct their own identities and talk about their experiences as maimed men who had suffered a serious bodily loss. Let's see. The first, so this is the handbill for the first competition. So $500, which is nothing to shake a stick at. In premium, so prizes, the best specimen of left-handed penmanship would receive $200. I think I zoomed in a little bit on this. Here we go. And so, you know, the number of awards increased after they got all their submissions, but this is not insignificant money. The committee of the award included the governor of New York, the president of the United States Sanitary Commission, a very famous poet, William Cullen Bryant, and the President Theodore Roosevelt's father, Theodore Roosevelt, who was a member of the Bureau of Employment for New York. They were in charge of trying to help veterans receive employment. And William Owen Bourne advertised all of these contests and the writings in his newspaper called The Soldier's Friend, which he had published during the war and continued after the war for a little while. So after telling you a little bit more about the contest and the contestants, then we'll move on to talking about some interconnected concepts that are crucial to understanding why these left-handed papers are so significant and what these veterans were sort of contending with when they wrote their narratives. The New York Times advertised the first contest in 1865, July 29th, 1865, so just a few months after the war. And it stipulated that any man who has lost his right arm in the service may compete. He may write an original or selected article upon a patriotic theme, and he must write not less than 2 nor more than 7 pages. The writer must also give his name in full, his regiment, company, and rank, the list of battles in which he was engaged, the place where he lost his arm, and his post office address. Eventually, they would stop limiting they would eventually say, it's okay, you can write more than 7 pages, because believe me, many of the men wrote more than 7 pages. And to this first contest, 270 men submitted penmanship samples. And in my book, I break down, how many were officers and how many were enlisted men. When the second competition came along, the next year, only 113 veterans, so not as many submitted to the second competition. But those who won the second contest received signed letters from 10 celebrated Union officers, including Grant, Farragut, Sheridan, So they received, in addition to some money, they received a signed letter from those officers. Let's see. So this is what I'm showing you right now is an invitation to one of the exhibitions of the penmanship. There was one in New York and one in Washington, D.C. Grant came to see the one in Washington, D.C. Lots of people came. There are many articles written about how impressive it was. By this time, they are the Left Arm Corps. This group of men is identified in this way, and they are disabled but not disheartened. Let's see, I see something in the chat. Was the monetary reward less for the second competition and thereby a reduced number of submissions? That's a good question. It seems like it's a little bit less. I mean, Bourne was struggling to publish his newspaper by this point. It's not cheap running a newspaper. He also said if he had known how much work running these contests would be, he probably wouldn't have done it. So yeah, I think that could be part of it. I also think that maybe some men who had participated in the first one were like, well, I'm not going to participate in the second one, though there are men who participate in both. And so it's interesting to look at the differences between what they say in one entry and then what they say 1 year later. Directions for the second, one difference also in the second contest. I don't know why my presentation's being weird. For the second contest, and this could also have decreased the number of people who were submitting, they had to submit signed affidavits for their to prove that they had lost their right arm. Some men in the first, like some veterans had expressed concern that men would lie, that contestants would lie and say, I lost my right arm. And Bourne had said, no, we're going to publish a list of the contestants with their regiments and where they're from, and that will keep people from lying. But by the second contest, they were requiring affidavits. So this is the affidavit of Louis J. Booz, who is swearing that he lost his right arm at Todd's Tavern, Virginia, on May 7th, 1864. And they also had to attest to the fact that they had learned to write with their left hands after being wounded, not before. So they had to prove their disability, which is kind of interesting if you think about it. Prove that it was legitimate. Sorry, this is out of order. Okay. And also what's interesting from these affidavits, you can see like it sometimes says they were amputated at the lower third. So that means, somewhere around this area. So this is proving that Louis J. Booz deserves to participate. They also asked contestants to send in photographs. And so some of them sent in photographs that only show their face. So you would have no proof of their wound if you were just looking at the photograph. Some, though, like Burritt Stiles of Connecticut, sent in full-length images. In this one, this is his artificial arm. He is demonstrating. Now, I don't know how good this music would sound if we were listening to it, but he's demonstrating his ability to play the violin with his artificial arm. He also sent in, however, this image, which very prominently displays his stump. According to the Reward Committee's report, the leading purpose of the competition was to show men like Stiles and that they could fit themselves for positions and usefulness. Of course, Bourne, who's organizing this competition, is not a disabled man, has not faced combat, has not endured the surgeon's saw. So he has a slightly less complicated view of what disability means, right? He thinks that these contest entries, all of these fragments will come together to kind of be a sign of the eventual reunification of the nation, but also the successful reintegration of men, of amputees into American society. The testimonies of veterans like Burritt styles, however, complicate the optimistic aspirations of the contest, and also call into, like, many of them talk about how bad artificial limbs were. Some of them could not wear artificial limbs because they had lost their arm at the shoulder, so there wasn't enough of a stump to latch onto. Some of them said they were extremely uncomfortable. Only a few guys said that they were okay. They were not the very fancy prostheses that we have today, that's for sure. So like I said, the rules of these contests stipulated that they should identify the battles where they lost their arms, and also just give a description of their service. But some of them went beyond that simple identification and described in graphic detail, well, not as graphic as you might expect, but still graphic for the 19th century. Then they detail their wounds and amputations. In this way, they're going against sort of this stricture on veterans that I think persists to this day, to suffer silently, and was especially prevalent in the Civil War. And so, I mean, my people who have read my book and talked to me, like, they're still surprised by how ungraphic it is and how they don't really spend that much time mourning their loss. But for the time, they are spending a significant amount of time talking about their loss. And so when they write about their amputation, when they talk about the process by which they lost their arms, they're really going beyond and uncovering what was beneath the empty sleeve that was so prevalent in Civil War culture at the time. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time talking about what the empty sleeve was. You may have heard of it before. The main thing to know is that in popular literature of the war, empty sleeves spoke on behalf of wounded veterans and amputees. There was a poem called The Empty Sleeve, which inspired a song, which inspired these engravings. And even Bourne, in his paper, printed an article, which is at the top of this screen, about empty sleeves. He said, well, he didn't write this, but basically that empty sleeves are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. They speak more eloquently than tongue or type of patriotism, of courage, of faith in the right, of hope in justice. Empty sleeves that tell of the honor upheld, of a nation saved, of the homes defended, of valor, of daring. So you can see here the empty sleeve is doing the talking. The veteran who's wearing the empty sleeve is not telling his story. Empty sleeves were slightly more common than empty pant legs. The Union Army reported 16,147 amputations involving part or all of the arm, and 13,833 amputations of any part of the legs. Arms were just easier targets. If you picture how men are holding their guns, the right arm in particular, if you picture how most men who are right-handed would hold their rifles. A poem by David Barker entitled The Empty Sleeve was very popular at the time, published in 1863. And in it, a speaker talks on behalf of a veteran with an empty sleeve. So he's just observing it. He talks on behalf of this silent veteran, saying that it is a telltale thing, that is a weird, queer thing. It's this kind of weird absence and presence. And like the article in The Soldier's Friend, the poem says everything that the empty sleeve tells of. It tells of the battlefield, of its gore, the sabers clash, the cannons roar, other things that rhyme. And a gazing throng gathers around this soldier. This is the illustration. It's not great quality, but this is the illustration that accompanied the poem in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. So an older veteran is two children are confronting him and sort of asking him for an explanation. This in turn, like I said, inspired a very popular engraving where we have a very cherubic child who is trying to figure out what's going on with her dad, what's going on with his empty sleeve, and the veteran is not speaking. He's looking sort of very forlorn with a very sad mustache. and the child is left to just sort of look at the empty sleeve and try to understand what's going on. Again, the veteran's not speaking. This is an actual empty sleeve veteran, Henry Meacham, who published a book called The Empty Sleeve, or The Life and Hardships of Henry H. Meacham in the Union Army. And here you have his actual child looking at the sleeve. He looks slightly more, I don't know if the word is happy. We all know what 19th century photos look like. But he doesn't look as forlorn as the other soldier, but still he's not explaining to the child what's going on. The child is again trying to figure out what's going on based on the empty sleeve. So I'm showing you these, and also there was also a song that became very popular called The Empty Sleeve. But basically I'm showing these to you to indicate what the Left Arm Corps were sort of writing against, because this was the empty sleeve had the potential to silence veterans and to cover over the gory stump beneath their empty sleeve. So rather than focusing on empty sleeves, the veterans in the contest focus on their stumps, also on their clumsy left hands. And they mourn the loss of their right arm, many of them. So they're refusing to become objects of pity, and instead they invest their missing or maimed right arms and their left arms, their newly able left arms, with significant symbolic power. So I'm just going to show you, I don't want to spend too much time. I don't know how much you guys are interested in poetry. I know my English major students are not that interested, so I don't want to spend too much time. But I wanted to show you how some of the men are talking about their right arms and then their left arms. Sherman, I've mentioned him before. He writes this to the soldier who he selected to give his premium to. He said that we have been accustomed to regard the loss of the right arm as almost fatal to a useful and consequently happy life. See how prejudiced they were against left arms? But these samples show how nature substitutes wisely and well our other arm. And I hope and trust that you may enjoy a long life, crowned by the contentment which the sacrifice of the best part of your body to your country's flag and safety is calculated to give. So he really articulates a very prevalent way of understanding what it meant to lose your life or your limb in the war for the Union. Soldiers died or lost part of their bodies in order to make the Union whole. That wholeness, though, gets a little complicated when you have men who have just parts of their right arms left. If there's still that stump or that fragment that remains. In substituting their left hand for their right, the contest implied veterans could reestablish their masculine competency and potency, and, like I said, re-enter the workforce. But members of the Left Arm Corps really attest the ways in which amputation impeded their ability to engage in what one contestant called manly labor. Though, as a side note, I will say I tracked as best as I could their occupations prior to the war and after the war, and many of them who were farmers, they remained farmers even with their newly reconfigured bodies, while others who had been farmers or were farm workers went on to find jobs that required less manual labor. These poems also show us the anxieties that the veterans had about incompetence and impotence, so sort of their viability as men, especially romantically speaking. And they link bodily disfigurement with romantic rejection, though again, most of them got married and had many children. There were only a few confirmed bachelors that I found. But it's telling that in the immediate aftermath of their wounding, they're concerned that their wounds and their amputation will make them less manly and less appealing to women. Phineas P. Whitehouse, he has my favorite name of any of them. He was a corporal from the 6th New Hampshire Volunteers. He kept both his right arm and hand, but they were useless, basically, which is sort of an interesting. So if you look at him, he looks like he still has both limbs, but really he just has one functional limb. His poem, entitled My Crippled Arm, won $25 for literary merit in the first competition. And he talks about the sort of very fractured relationship between his former limb and his current shattered remnant of a limb. I just want to let you look at the penmanship for a moment. His penmanship slants the same way that right-handed penmanship slants generally. You could learn how to do it either way. So some of them went back slanted, some of them went the traditional way. Though his arm was strong for manly labor and hardy once, it could wield the pen or till New England soil. It is now a feeble thing, a piteous wreck. And he asks his readers, can you wonder that a cloud comes over me? A rebel bullet's madness is what caused it to become a weak and feeble patient. But he turns in the poem and says, okay, well, yes, one arm is no longer here, or is no longer able to continue on, but I still have one true and faithful stout arm. And with heaven to aid him, he's going to labor with a cheerful heart. And he believes that lone arm, a final victory will see. He's invoking sort of, the final victory of Judgment Day, and of joining Christ in heaven, but also sort of that he's not going to be able to fight anymore, but his arm will continue to serve him. So unlike an empty sleeve, though his arm is shapeless and feeble, as he calls it, it doesn't obscure meaning. It's a constant reminder for Whitehouse of what happened to him, but also of his resilience and of a new form of masculinity that he's constructing that's not going to depend on an artificial limb or on a right hand, but instead on perseverance and dedication. Thomas Perrine is one of my favorite contestants. He uses a lot of puns, and I like puns. He was from Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I explained already, sinister comes from the word sinistra. Manuscript means hand is manu, by hand, scripta is written. So he entitled his submission A Sinister Manuscript. And he was living in Michigan, but he was actually a member of the 140th Pennsylvania Volunteers. So here you go. One interesting thing he does is he links racial identity and political agency and masculinity to bodily wholeness. So losing a right arm kind of throws everything up in the air for Perrine. Like I said, he uses a lot of puns. He claims that losing his right arm is tantamount to losing his identity as an enfranchised white American man. And adding insult to injury, it also results in romantic rejection. He talks about his stump in a way that embodies his and other contestants' concerns about their competency. A shell fragment struck his humorous vein, but his sense of humor is still intact, as you will see. He takes as the title Arma Virumque Cano, which, if anyone speaks Latin, you may recognize. I had to look it up when I first encountered it, but it is the first line of Virgil's Aeneid, and it means, I sing of arms and of a man. So he's slyly invoking that, he's slyly turning the story of losing his arm into a mock epic. He first mentions one of the repercussions that when he comments on May Day, a woman named Miss May Day, D-E-Y, he lost his arm on May Day, and then he loses May Day when he returns home from the front, lacking the hand he had previously promised to his sweetheart. So, you plight your troth with your hand. There's a lot of hand stuff that goes on with engagements. And so since he no longer had his right hand, she refused to accept it. I offered her my other hand, uninjured by the fight. 'Twas all that I had left. I said, she said, 'twould not be right. So again, all these puns. Interestingly, he also connects this, like I said, to his racial identity as a white man, because he invokes the 1857 Supreme Court decision about against Dred Scott's suit for freedom, and writes, "These Negroes all," Judge Taney said, "a white man's rights do lack. The rebels left not right to me. I might as well be black." So not only has he lost his woman, he has also lost his sort of standing as a white man who has political power. Of course, this is all an exaggeration. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Perrine's post-war life later on. What's important to remember is that he did remain, even a wounded soldier remained white and could keep it and could still vote. But he is linking sort of this loss to a loss of his identity. His one consolation, he tells us, is that when congressmen shall say "to arms," and he spells it with TWO, they can't say that to him. So he's no longer up for the draft because he has evidence of his proof of his service, that he has already made his sacrifice. The left arm, of course, is equally important in the collection of papers, since men are relying on their left hands and their left arms. Left, like I said before, it has cultural connotations of weakness, effeminacy, ineffectuality, and evil, as we learned from somebody in the chat. It's impossible to know if some of these men were actually left-handed prior to losing their right arm. I have my suspicions about some of them, since their penmanship is way better than anything I could ever produce with my right hand. But some of these specimens show that some men took to writing with their other hands with greater alacrity and skill than others. So these men have become left-handed. They are navigating these new identities, and they're having to contend with the stigmas associated with left-handedness in the context of a contest that emphasizes the superiority of the right hand. But the contest also suggests that the left hand can be taught and shaped and made almost right, not quite, but almost. Henry W. Palmer, a 20-year-old veteran of the Maine Volunteers, he apostrophized, so he invoked his missing hand, his missing right arm. He didn't write a poem, he wrote in prose, but it's almost poetic in the way he's addressing this limb. He says, "Thou wert a member of a perfect body given to country in her day of trial. And while Virginia's soil is enriched by thy decay, the remnant of that soldier body is reserved for such further duties as country may demand." So his arm is symbolic because of amputation, and not because of its former status as a member of a perfect body. Here we go, just in case you couldn't read it before. He also goes into an elaborate situation in which his right arm wills all of its abilities to the left arm. So it becomes a testator. There's like a lot of legal language that he uses. He describes how he sought out his right arm. He could not find it. And then the left arm received an immediate promotion on the battlefield. And then, like I said, he wills all of the abilities of the right hand to the left hand. He said, "The seal of this last will and testament was the blood seal of amputation. Patriotism, love of country, and equal rights were the subscribing witnesses to the instrument." So he's personifying not only his left and right arms, but also the abstract ideals of service in the Union Army, and he's making his personal sacrifice of national importance. Let's see. How much time do I have left, by the way?
Oh, you're doing good, 15, 20 minutes or so.
Oh, perfect. Okay, good. I didn't want to. Any questions while I'm pausing right now?
Well, yeah, this is Dave. So as I understand the the contest, there were, between the two contests, there were about 400 participants. And you mentioned there were about 16,000 amputees. So I'm curious how it was expected that this would achieve some of the stated goals across, such a broad or a large number of victims.
Well, one thing to keep in mind is that left hand, 16 of those 16,000, some were left-handed, left arm amputations.
Okay.
So those guys are out of luck. They're not allowed to participate because the assumption is that they were already right-handed, so it's not as big of a loss. Yeah, I mean, what you notice if you look at the demographics of the contestants, they're mostly a large number of them are from New York. That makes sense because Bourne is from New York. Those guys who came and talked to him in the hospital, many of them participated. Also large numbers from Pennsylvania, so that sort of, and Massachusetts. So sort of the states that gave the most soldiers to the Union Army tended to also produce the most participants in the contest. But yeah, you're not wrong. It's very lofty goals for this contest. Let's see. So I want to be sure to show you the very impressive penmanship of Alfred Whitehouse, no relation to Phineas P. Whitehouse as far as I can tell. He's an Englishman who comes to the country and enlists in 1859 and is wounded in the first battle of the war. And so he's one of the earliest pensioners. And this is his extremely impressive, decorative penmanship. He wins an award, a very well-deserved reward for what is it called? Ornamental penmanship, as opposed to business penmanship. Notice he's aligning himself with the left arm core, but just, I mean, oops, I don't know what's good, sorry. You're experiencing what my students get to experience, where my prezzies just go crazy for some reason. But just look at the intricacy and there's no way this guy wasn't right, it wasn't at least ambidextrous. I don't know. You guys can see what you think. But he referred to himself as Bourne's left arm soldier friend because he had met Bourne. And he, just to give you a little bit of detail about his wounding, since I haven't gone into detail about any of their woundings, he narrated that he remained upon the battlefield. So this was at Bull Run. He remained upon the battlefield about 6 days among his wounded and dying comrades, till his shattered arm was full of maggots. And then finally, his arm was amputated in Richmond, so probably by Confederate surgeons, before he was sent under a flag of truce. But just imagine that. And he's not alone in having to be there with his arm and his wound for many days prior to amputation. It wasn't always immediate. Some men just lost their whole arm when a cannonball hit it. Others suffered through days of waiting to see if infection would set in. Others were right away on the field amputated. But he was not one of them. He had to wait. So he talks about how the right arm's gone, the nation yet remains. Though many perished, yet we are saved. This is his poem. Again, I apologize for the joltiness of this presentation. I don't really know what's going on. And his poetry is not great, but it is very meaningful. He says, the pen is mightier than the sword and can be wielded from right to left with great effect. He also calls on the men reading his poetry to give them work that they can do. And don't be afraid of what we can't do, because one arm is not two. According to him, labor is a God-given right, regardless of a right arm's presence or absence. So he frames his changed body in terms of its competence and adaptive skills, thus constructing a form of left-handedness that is deserving of praise. Excuse me. And he was a painter. before and after the war. He painted signs, including the sign for William Bourne's newspaper. And just a side note, all of the men that I've talked about so far are their full entries, or at least selections of them, are in the book, if you want to read more about them. Okay, so I wanted to end by talking about some of the veterans' post-war lives, and to think about their legacies. These contests testify to survival and loss, successful adaptation, and painful readjustment. And Bourne himself argued that they were the genuine testimony to the character of our volunteer soldiers. Almost all of the contestants were volunteers. Only a few were drafted, and maybe one was a substitute, though it's a little bit foggy looking at his records. So for the majority are volunteers. One specimen that actually won the first premium of $200 in the first contest was submitted by a man named Franklin H. Durrah of Philadelphia, actually. Shortly after winning the contest, though, that was supposed to prove that he was ready to re-enter society, find employment, and triumph, he was committed by his mother to an insane asylum, where he eventually died. He was transferred to another institution where he eventually died. So his penmanship was meant to serve as a marker of survival and a promise of success, but he soon became another casualty of the war. The stories of men like him, who are forever marked by the Civil War, are crucial to understanding the ways in which soldiers conceptualized their service to the Union and their place in post-war American society. So rather than just aligning themselves with this rhetoric of promised rehabilitation and recuperation, they presented fragmented bodies and fractured selves, while also asserting the importance of their sacrifice. They presented to the public reconfigured forms of masculinity and bodily ability, and they framed their missing and remaining limbs strategically as poetic subjects worthy of respect. So I promised I'd tell you a little bit about the afterlives of some of these men, the post-war lives. Thomas Perrine, the author of Sinistra Manuscripta, he was a second sergeant in Company G, 144th Pennsylvania Infantry, and was 22 and in college when he enlisted. He was wounded at Chancellorsville, his first and only battle. Quite a few of them are wounded like right away. Others make it through like the list of all the most famous battles, and then they're wounded near the end. He graduated from college in 1865, so he didn't waste any time, and attended law school and became a lawyer. He was an attorney, a judge, and a newspaper editor in Minnesota before moving to Colorado in hopes of benefiting his health. It's another thing to keep in mind that many of these men are suffering. One man dies in 1905 as a result of his wounds. He had chosen not to be amputated, so he had to have constant treatments for his wounds. And finally, he travels to San Francisco in the hopes of benefiting his health, and he dies there in 1905. Perrine, he lived until 1878, so not a horribly long life, but despite his fears and his jolting by this May Day, he married a woman named Inez and had 2 stepdaughters. So that's but he died at 48 due to his wounds. Robert A. Pinn, let me try to make this work. Again, I'm sorry if anyone has, I don't know what this is going to activate, but nothing good. So this is Robert A. Pinn. So only 2 Black soldiers, 2 members of the United States Colored Troops, submitted to the contest, unfortunately. And this is probably due to, though the literacy rates went up for Black men who were enlisted, obviously literacy rates were lower. Many of these men were formerly enslaved, and it was illegal to teach them how to read and write. So that's one reason why there are fewer representatives. But this is Robert A. Pinn, a first sergeant, Company I, 5th United States Colored Infantry. And he was not born enslaved, but he was born the son of a formerly enslaved man. And because he could not enlist at the beginning of the war because of his race, he signed on as an aide to a surgeon for the 19th Ohio Infantry. And then finally, in 1863, was allowed to enlist. At the Battle of Chapin's Farm in Virginia in 1864, he received the Medal of Honor for taking command of his company after all the officers had been killed or wounded, and gallantly led it in battle. He married in 1867 and owned a business. He sold it, attended Oberlin College, and studied law, and eventually joined the Stark County Bar and practiced as a pension attorney, so helping other veterans get their pensions. He became junior vice commander of his local post of the Grand Army of the Republic in 1888 and died in 1911. And this image, this portrait of him was included by W.E.B. Du Bois in a collection of photographs of notable African Americans that was presented at the 1900 Paris Exposition. It's zooming out like that, it's very annoying. I really like this image because we have 3 generations here. This is Wallace Mordecai Moore. He has a great name. You'll see his remaining left hand he's using to hold one of his grandchildren while his daughter stands by. He was a private in Company E, 13th Pennsylvania Reserve. So I'm guessing many of you know this, but there were so many Pennsylvania men who wanted to enlist that they had extreme overflow. And at first they were like, guys, we can't, sorry, we can't, we have our regiments, we can't take any more. But then they started making the reserves. So all these, there are tons of reserve regiments that are filled with the men who didn't quite enlist in time to get in the initial set of regiments. So they're confusing because he's the 13th Pennsylvania Reserves, but also the 1st Pennsylvania Rifles. They're called the Bucktails because most of them before the war had been very good at shooting deer. And he eventually became the corporal of Company E, 190th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry. He married in 1866 and remained so until his wife died in 1920. He moved from Pennsylvania to Iowa, and he was elected auditor in 1872 amid cheers for, quote, one-armed Moore. And he served until 1883. So here's an example of a man entering into a profession that does not require manual labor, but does require penmanship. A lot of them got in trouble though for fraud. A lot of the guys who went into sort of being treasurers, I say a lot, but maybe like 3 or 4, a surprising number got in trouble for fraud. I don't know, maybe just being I'm not an accountant, maybe it's hard. He didn't get in trouble, luckily. He also served as postmaster of Mount Vernon, Iowa. That was also a very popular profession for these men. And he died in 1932 at the age of 90, survived by 3 children and 9 grandchildren. So I like when I can tell stories about them having long lives and not one shortened by their wounds. So he is one of them. All right, this is ridiculous. Okay. I don't want to take too much more time. Nope, this is not. You guys are really getting the full experience of being in my class. I will talk about one more Pennsylvanian. I want to show you his penmanship here. His name is William Fithian Moore. So he was born in 1836. Sorry, he's not a Pennsylvanian. He was born in Bridgeton, New Jersey. So I'm going to end with him. And he enlisted in August 1862. He received a gunshot wound at Spotsylvania Courthouse near the end of the war, and it disabled his right arm and hand. But even though he was wounded in that way, he continued his pre-war work as a tinsmith. So some men were able to continue their pre-war occupations. He married in 1870 and died in 1908. He is included in my book where he talks about his experience of entering into the zone of war and saying that things had the appearance of real war, constantly passing camps and hospitals. Here we see for the first the realities of war, the dead, dying, and wounded. So he provides a nice sort of introduction into the soldiering life, which is one of the reasons that I included him.